And Vancouver is very unique, I would say, in where our crisis lies. I mean, we have this situation in Vancouver where the downtown core is very dense, lots of high rises, lots of people living down there now. And then we have this big expanse as we go south and east of single family dwellings where they're expensive and people simply cannot afford them. And then you get out to the suburbs where again you pick up where you've got multifamily dwellings. So that's highly unusual to have what we call this big donut in the center of the city where housing density is just not on.
So welcome everyone today. We're really excited to have Joy Macphail joining us today. Joy is joining us from her home office, much as I am. Welcome, Joy.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you here. So you're, of course, on our Power 50 list this year, and you're there for all of the many points that you touch in our city and in our province. You're, of course, very well known for your history with the NDP and various ministerial roles that you held there, ranging from finance and education and labor and interim leader at one point. You know, while you retired from politics in 2015, 2005, you've stayed very involved. You're kind of the go-to fixer chair for a number of various organizations. You are chair of ICBC, chair of the Board of Trustees of Adler University, which is a pretty interesting university that has an outlet here in Vancouver. And of course, what we're going to talk to you about today is that you were appointed by the Ministers of Finance in BC and Canada to chair an expert panel on the future of housing supply and affordability. So that's been a fairly large part of, I imagine, what you're working on these days.
In the last year, definitely. And first, let me say I'm very honored to have been on the Power 50 list. You kind of get an imposter syndrome feeling.
Sure.
Very honored. Thank you.
It's very well deserved. Yeah, so well, let's chat a little bit about housing affordability. You know, it's a constant conversation in Vancouver, of course. And I think it's even further amplified during COVID right now. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about what you've been working on with this panel. Who's actually involved with this right now?
The two ministers of finance, then Bill Morneau federally and then Carol James provincially, appointed the panel about a year ago, pre-COVID, to deal, and they chose British Columbia. They agreed that it should be British Columbia because the housing crisis is absolutely the worst here in British Columbia, and particularly in Metro Vancouver. And it was the panel was appointed to focus on a particular aspect of housing, and that was what's called the missing middle. Now it's a double entendre, because missing middle to the experts refers to the type of housing, row housings, 4 or 5 story apartments, duplexes, laneway houses, etc. So the missing middle, where there's not a lot. In Vancouver, it's either a single family dwelling or high rises. But the other aspect of missing middle is the missing middle income earners who just simply cannot afford housing in Metro Vancouver, and to a certain extent in the Victoria area as well, and even in Kelowna. So we've been focusing on both of those areas of the housing crisis. We're 6 people of expertise either in the economy or in the field of housing. I always say I think my expertise is just chairing. I chair a good meeting. Yeah. But I have the file has been very important to me, and I've learned a lot. We've consulted with a wide range of stakeholders, those who are in the business of housing, those who need housing, people who have lived experience in housing crises, professors out at UBC that specialize in this, developers, planners at the city level, city governments, provincial MLAs, and federal MPs as well. And we've taken all of that information, and we are pretty close to writing our final report with recommendations to the two levels of government about what can be done in a very pragmatic, expeditious way to increase the supply of housing, affordable housing.
Yeah, interesting. So, and yeah, getting back to that missing middle, I think there's a lot of conversation sometimes around the fact that teachers, police officers, service workers, people that you need to have a functioning city have a very hard time affording a home in this city.
Yes, and that even goes up to what we think are the professions that may earn more, such as doctors, and young lawyers, engineers, young engineers, but definitely our public service workers that we rely on to be close at hand. Do you want your police force and your firefighting force to have to travel in an hour to work in an emergency situation?
Right.
No, that's simply not on. And Vancouver is very unique, I would say, in where our crisis lies. I mean, we have this situation in Vancouver where the downtown core is very dense, lots of high rises, lots of people living down there now. And then we have this big expanse as we go south and east of single family dwellings where they're expensive and people simply cannot afford them. And then you get out to the suburbs where again you pick up where you've got multifamily dwellings. So that's highly unusual to have what we call this big donut in the center of the city where housing density is just not on. The other thing that we're examining is how we can increase transit and tie transit, the expansion of transit, to affordable housing around the nubs of the transit stations. Oh, and I would just say one last thing, if I may, is that there's a great imbalance in our Metro Vancouver area, and I would say in our province, between those who rent and those who own. And we've really been remiss as a province and as a Canadian government in providing affordable rental housing.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, there was a report that just came out today that said, I think average 2-bedroom, actually I have it down here, they're saying is 2,700 roughly, average 1-bedroom 1,900. I mean, yeah, sort of unreal numbers, right?
Exactly. And you know, that's after tax income that you're
Right.
paying, as we all know.
Sure. Yeah.
After tax income. And certainly we're finding out that the rules, certainly the taxation rules at both the provincial and federal level, lend itself to encouraging home ownership. But is that, a lot of people will never be able to save up a down payment. This missing middle group that we're talking about in the current environment anyway. So we need to have governments that can encourage a taxation system, a subsidy system that encourages people to get rental housing.
Right. And I wonder, so, I mean, in terms of your methodology, have you been looking at cities around the world and how they've managed it? I know Vienna, for example, is sort of long held up because I think it's 40% of their housing stock that's actually social housing there. They look at it as a human right.
Yes, and very good. You know this stuff. Yeah. And Vienna is, when it's social housing, it means government-owned housing, but there's a wide range of housing for. It's not supportive housing is what we would call. You know, right. It's people who work and raise families and may rent their entire life, and their rental agent could be the government. It's a very successful model. We've been getting a lot of information from around the world. South of the border, even, there are some jurisdictions, cities that are doing a pretty good job, better than other jurisdictions. There are also some horrible examples south of the border.
Sure.
We're looking at Holland. The Netherlands is another example of a different model of provision of housing. So it's very exciting. It's very exciting, all of the work that we're doing. And we're getting the best and the biggest brains to help us. And we're talking to the people who live these experiences every day. And so we're very fortunate.
Okay, so yeah, in terms of how this is all coming together, when you say live these experiences, you're pulling in sort of comments and experiences from people on what it's like to search for housing right now, to try to budget for it, that sort of thing.
That's right. And we're talking
Okay.
to not-for-profit
Okay.
community agencies that struggle, are excellent providers of largely rental accommodation, and the difficulties they have with the mismatches of programs between the provincial and the federal level. We're talking with city councilors around the province who are, by and large, I would say in the vast, vast majority, city governments want to provide more housing, need to provide more housing, recognize that as their obligation, but they face barriers, and the time to develop and approve housing is really bogged down, I would say,
Mhm.
across the province.
Yeah. So what have been some of the barriers when you say things are really bogged down? You mentioned transit. Transit obviously is important. Have there been other barriers that you've seen that have come up through discussions?
Well, we have to, when we talk about barriers, let's talk about it from a couple of perspectives. The first
Mhm.
one is, how do we increase the supply? You need a developer, and you need someone to approve that development, and you need financing. And the developer can be a not-for-profit developer, or it can be a for-profit developer. I'm finding that their interests are not contrary to each other. It's not like they're fighting each other for space. They both the private developers and the not-for-profits want to increase the housing supply. But as one developer told us, when you cross the block on Boundary Road from Vancouver to Burnaby, there's a whole different set of rules.
Hmm.
There's a whole different set of forms. There's a whole different set of obligations. There's a different way of what the public input is for those approvals. There's the way that various neighborhoods approach housing in their community can be diverse across an individual city, and across the community. Standardization, consistency, reliability is what developers say they need, and we agree, in order to increase housing supply. The other thing that we face is, as I've kind of referred to, is NIMBYism.
Mm.
Uh, when you have a city where 70% plus of the land is zoned for single family dwellings,
Mhm.
one house on one piece of property, those owners have sometimes a vested interest in ensuring that their property remains that valuable,
Mhm.
and that the supply is not increased in their neighborhood. So not in my backyard.
Yeah.
NIMBY is a very difficult uh, sentiment to deal with.
Mhm.
And I don't blame people. I don't blame people at all. People, particularly in British Columbia, people use their house as their retirement savings. I get
Right.
that. I
Right.
totally, and we get that, I should say. But nevertheless, there has to be some, we hope that there can be some happy medium. Of course, politicians need to hold public hearings before a property is rezoned. And we're looking at ways where we can help city governments to change the method by which they zone properties, and perhaps have a broader public hearing than rather just the neighborhood where the apartment is being proposed.
Yeah, and there is something to those sort of low-rise buildings, townhouses, of course, but even the six-level apartment buildings that just don't seem to get built much anymore, that have a real sort of natural way of building community in neighborhoods too, right? When you have
Exactly.
those kind of smaller, very livable, very, not creating these sort of like long corridors of high rise, high rise, high rise that people
Yeah.
do tend to feel resistant to and don't think of as densification, but that is quite community oriented.
Yeah. Well, you raise a very good point, because we did hear from some young professionals, public sector workers, who have rented,
Mhm.
and now they have a family, and they can't find rental accommodation. They are not able to get into the market to buy. Even though it's a goal for young, people to buy, but it's impossible in many circumstances. So they're looking for a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment, and they want to, or they've been living in a 1 bedroom apartment with their toddler, and now they want to expand, but they can't find the right kind of accommodation where they can stay in their community and
Right.
raise a family in a way that's affordable for them.
Right.
So again, that missing middle, where you have a 5 or 6 story apartment, but it's got 2 and 3 bedroom flats in it, so that people
Mhm.
can raise a family as well and stay in the neighborhood and stay with their school or their daycare center or their gym.
Yeah, yeah. And I wondered, you mentioned this started before COVID and obviously has continued through COVID. Has anything changed to the discussion during that as this sort of added layer that's come into play now?
Yes, absolutely. Just like COVID has changed almost everything in our lives.
Hmm.
It's been quite interesting to see short-term changes, and we don't know yet whether they'll turn into long-term trends. But uh, the short-term rental market has changed substantially. Airbnb, so that a lot of short-term rental accommodation that was taken off the market for people who want long-term rental, a year lease or a 2-year lease, that product is now coming back on the market.
Right.
Who knows how long it will stay on the market, but there are owners who are adding supply, which has been great, absolutely great. And of course, that again moderates rent increases as well.
Hmm.
And in some
Hmm.
cases, there's been rent reduction for um, long-term leases. But the other thing is, just like you and I are talking from our homes,
Hmm.
um, people are working, a substantial portion of the population is able to work from home. And that has changed what kind of accommodation people want. People want outdoor space, whereas, in the past, we would pay a premium to live downtown, to be
Hmm.
close to theater and restaurants, etc. We'd pay a premium in a smaller space so we could have access to the culture and Epicurean specialties of the downtown area. Now people want a backyard or a big deck, and that means they're going further out into the suburbs, even into the exurbs, to get that accommodation. And that mainly, um, the the further you get out into the suburbs, the less they've had to actually produce missing middle housing. So
Hmm.
there's not a lot of rental accommodation, but that's all changing. There's various cities are paying very close attention to providing this. um, so it is changing substantially, but who knows whether that's going to be a long-term trend or not.
Hmm.
I feel like the workplace there will be permanent changes to the workplace, perhaps not where 2/3 of your workforce is working from home, or 3/4, but that people will spend a few days working at home, a couple of days
Hmm.
at home, and then maybe going into the office. Will employers need less office space? What do you do with that office space that becomes vacant? Is that a good source of conversion to affordable housing?
Right. Yeah. And with that, we start to see maybe, the city of Vancouver in particular has all these climate goals, as does the province, that encouraging that kind of reduced commute, all that kind of thing is bound to have some positive impacts there as well.
Yes, and I mean, the public transit system is expanding greatly in Metro Vancouver, with investments from the federal government and the provincial governments. SkyTrain extensions, rapid transit out to almost to UBC, hopefully to UBC. And then, of course, there's a rapid transit extension going out from Surrey to Langley, um, out further into the Fraser Valley. All wonderful stuff. And what we're saying is, or what I shouldn't say what we're saying, we have not landed on our final recommendations yet, but what we're investigating is it on behalf of the two levels of government. Is there a way that you can, with your massive investments, government, encourage or tie various carrots? Maybe if they don't take a carrot, a little bit of a stick to say, build affordable housing, increase the supply around those transit stations.
Right. Okay. And so you said you're in your final stages. When can we expect to see the report out? When can
Well, our
read it?
goal was to have it completed and out by the end of this year, by December 31. We've been delayed a little bit because of COVID. We had to reschedule a lot of meetings and consultations with mayors and councillors because they were consumed with COVID, rightly so, et
Sure.
cetera. So we're still aiming for the end of December, but it may spill over into the beginning of 2021.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I look forward to reading it. And thank you again for joining us today, Joy, and congrats again for being on the Power 50
Thank
this
you
year.
very much for having me. Thank
Okay,
you.
take care.